Thank you for coming. This is going to be more of a reading than a talk. I'm hoping there's be time to talk afterwards, but what I wanted to do tonight is read one poem from my last book. That book is called Orient. And then the majority of the time is going to be spent reading an essay that's trying to situate that poem specifically in the book more generally, and even more generally than the book itself, trying to situate my relationship to poetry, to some of the concerns, public-facing political concerns, as well as inward, private-facing personal concerns. So the poem is called Book of Origins, and the essay is called On Deserts. Book of Origins. 1. In the beginning, the sound of I was given into a certain emptiness existing, caliphate or sky. It wasn't even morning. Because the world and weight of human thought as it exists in actual relation to a context experienced primarily as physical. Translation is necessity. We were a garden once, the limits of our language, God. 2. When I was 10, I watched the war begin on television. I was at a party. It was a birthday party. We were listening to radio. I called the station and requested music. They played it. We sang along. I called again and danced. I was drinking Coca-Cola. I was eating ice cream. I was American. My friends were all around me. I walked upstairs in the living room. Parents watched a sitcom in recliners. The news came on. I sat on the couch. The news washed over me. In my memory, the green bright traces of artillery, the night above the desert trembling. I had never seen a war. I wept. I was at a party. It was a birthday party. My father took me home. 3. Agree or disagree. A person prays alone within a circle made of talk and is political. This is one of several narratives existing in the contentious space of borders erected to delineate the real and unreal fact of difference, limits, edges, frontiers, flower beds, etc. These are not the same, although after centuries of warfare, one begins to question the extent. I used to think that it was possible to turn away, as if for a long time, as if from difference our lives erase themselves and seethe again within the exit of an artwork, entered and expanded and expressed the seeds of an alternative or night. No one carries us. There are things we sing among. 4. It was summer and we were driving as a family. My mother and sister slept in the back seat. A song came on. The stars were out. My father turned it up. It was late and we were looking for a campsite. The music was familiar. I'd heard the song before in a movie about a war. I asked my father if he remembered, and he did. I asked if he'd been drafted, if he had fought. He said he wasn't. He said he was, but that he hadn't. He kept his eyes on the road. The song continued. The road was dark. I asked him why. He took my hand. The night and song continued. The road grew darker. He was my father. 5. In originating energy, sunlight passes through the vacant static that surrounds it. A bridge of gold suspended in the air above a setting draped in sand. This connection spans the spectacle between the landscape and the sky, the real and the imaginary. One looks because one must, the world returning in the aftermath. One looks to look away. 6. Of adolescence with my father, the trees in the gray lake shaking their disturbances, the birds believing us, his brother echoing an owl home across the water, bringing it to tree again, proven our volition, voiced in August ash and whirl and wash of white, blue ache the sky. In Canada were called to yearly every summer. the day's perennial advance across the continent, a compass pointing us to shore or path in the forest, opening, its fragments there, but only barely, an incandescent blur, the waves returning, his scattered form in old direction, traced our time together, leaving a certain stillness centered in our language, leaving. 7. Aspiring to meet what it is not, the mind begins beyond its edges. This desire forms the invisible dimensions of a cage in which the distance between a person's freedom and the atrocity of actions claiming to defend it acquires a meaning one did not imagine. 8. The dead do not come back. I speak to them and through them to bring you closer. I speak to wrench the water from our names. Desert, sphere, eros, ultimatum, rain cloud, desert, morning, a militia, broadcast, reason, shoreline, vision, beam of terror, men, geometry as pets, diaphanous, the desert, Akbar, Allahu as limit, image, thing, state of center, fear as other, art. So that's, it's a poem from a book called Orient. That book came out in 2018, so it's been some time. And so this is an essay I've been working on for, I think, close to 4 years. It's still not done. And the essay is thinking about that book. It's thinking about the things in that book, like the war in Syria is one of the recurring, that was happening while that was going on. And so the essay is thinking about that. It's also thinking about fatherhood right after this book came out. I became a dad. So this is called On Deserts. In the spring of 2018, my second book arrived upon my doorstep. I promptly opened the roughed-up box from Cleveland and touched the cover, my name inscribed in red ink against a desert photograph taken above a distant vantage far above the landscape. In Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin, where the sand-bright rolling folds of a desert feel fictitious and far away, a new world was just becoming visible. Sprouts of young grass pushed themselves through lawns of patchy snow, an infant promise, and birdsong lifted evanescent from the trees. For a writer, the day you hold your book for the first time feels something close to the birth of a child, a presence in the world that one has made, a language tended to and raised. When I first began the book, the civil war in Syria had only recently begun to populate my newsfeed. One morning, while eating breakfast in my living room, I watched a woman on my television, an asylum seeker speaking candidly with a reporter. Exhausted but defiant, she asked in Arabic what made it difficult for those on the other side of the camera to imagine that she needed to cross the desert. In my memory, the light had draped itself around her like a shawl. She held her daughter. I do not know their names. Although the distance between the Midwest and the Middle East feels largely unnavigable to me, the war continues happening, and my relation to it still occurs as something I both do and do not experience. On some level, I'm cognizant of my cognition, of my connection to other places. The United States is bigger than its borders, and yet, in the relative seclusion of rural Wisconsin, my life continues unabated. Since the Syrian Day of Rage protests first began in March of 2011, I finished a prestigious year-long fellowship, completed grad school, and started teaching at a university. In that time, I've lived in 2 different countries on different continents. In one of them, I met my wife and married her. In the other, we bought an unassuming yellow house in a small Midwestern town, and I became a father to her daughter. A year and a half ago, in the living spring of morning, we had another, and recently she started speaking. The words my youngest daughter uses do not exist. Hers is a language made entirely of sounds and vocal intuitions, the significance of which feels insular and far away, but only partially. My wife and I take great joy in our attempts to translate. She's hungry, my wife will say. She's tired, I will say. And usually we're right. Our daughter's world and words are small. They correlate directly to her surroundings and point to little else beyond the fleeting present moment of experience. She speaks what she can see. For some, the capacity to point to the things of the world with language is innate. The American linguist Noam Chomsky first proposed the existence of an internal language acquisition device, or LAD, in 1965. In aspects of the theory of syntax, he suggests our aptitude for speech takes residence in the brain itself, a kind of universal faculty whose solitary purpose is to translate the noise produced by others. Central to his thesis, however, is an understanding of a word's inherent insufficiency. For Chomsky, the development of speech is shaped by an environment defined by absence, insofar as there exists a poverty of the stimulus. By this he means the world in which a child listens lacks ample grammatical diversity. That which is present, the noises made by siblings, parents, and by peers, cannot account for the complex patterning of sound the child's language eventually becomes. Thus, the human noise to which my daughter is exposed falls short of her capacity to track the syntax swooning all around her, the sounds of other people filling up the room. Said differently, the alphabet she uses arises in the distance where I and other meet within the murky ambit of their overlap. And what she sees exists at the periphery, the pale blue walls of the room in which she wakes, the open window in the yard beyond it, the garden in the back west corner barely hanging on. She sees the kitchen where mother cooks, her sister feeding her father home from work and standing tired in the doorway. What she feels, however, what my wife translates as hunger or eyes and need for sleep, exists on the other side. A private world beyond the wall her body is, a desert where all the words I've learned fall short. The other day, for example, I watched my daughter walk. Wobbling, arms outstretched, she piloted the mess of plastic toys, plush animals, and the partially eaten food scraps that seemed so steadily to fill our house, and made her way to the couch on the other side. Deliberately and with effort, she climbed it, pulled the curtain back, the day's end coming in around her, the low light of an early autumn in Wisconsin living on her neck and shoulders. And then she simply looked. There, beyond the border of the glass, leaves fell. A flutter of brown sparrows landed on the branches of an adolescent maple. Our neighbor Rusty waved from the open window of a black, dilapidated truck. Waving back, my daughter made a noise I couldn't translate. A wall rose up between us, a century of sand. Her looking felt like years. To all the challenges a parent faces, the lack of sleep, insanity, the lack of time, of money, I'd like to add the absence of a common tongue. The nagging solipsistic possibility that my daughter's inner life might remain invisible emerges like the quiet of a desert night, an expanse whose breadth is only maybe crossable. At the precise moment in my life when I want nothing more than to live beyond myself, I think of language as a kind of water, an oasis in the sand. Of course, my daughter will someday learn to speak as I do, and hopefully she'll also learn to speak in Thai. Somewhat selfishly, I look forward to listening to the women in my life around the dining table, the rise and fall of words whose music makes no sense to me, at least not anymore. A second-generation immigrant, I lost my mother's tongue at the age of 5 when I joined Miss Campbell's morning kindergarten class, and I never got it back. My mom tells me I came home one day refusing to speak in Thai, though I do not remember this. At times I wonder if the reason I have so consistently left Wisconsin for Thailand throughout my life is in some way to experience again whatever world I lost when my second tongue turned reticent. In like manner, I also wonder if this reticence guided me to poems. Despite the attention they demand, and perhaps in part because of it, the more I read, the more convinced I am that poems construct a larger abstract map, one that charts a second world just there beyond the border of my normal linguistic habits, a kind of foreign country to which the poem itself is passage. In this light, reading and writing are at once a form of traveling and of translation, of leaving how you speak and think and see and arriving somewhere else as someone else with a different kind of tongue. Thus, the poets that matter most to me make possible an experience of otherness sorely missing from the inborn habits of my life as an individual. There is much I do not know. The world exceeds me, and the words with which I have spent my life engaged feel limited. This is true not only in regard to the unsaid subjectivities of people that so often take residence in poems, but also, and maybe more so, the gift of otherness that poetry makes accessible resonates in the attempt of writers to inhabit and make sense of everything we can't, the sparkling invisibility of things beyond the reach of our cognition that Keats so famously described in his letters as mystery, uncertainty, and doubt. Teeming with connections, these fertile spaces pressed between us feel haunted with aporias and pauses, with things we cannot see. For me, this suggests a deep ecology of being, one in which we speak to more ourselves, to others, and to that we do not know. The alphabet existing as a bridge connecting islands, crossing deserts. There are things we live among, writes the poet George Oppen at the beginning of Being Numerous, and to see them is to know ourselves. But can we? And if so, how? Though it was real, the first desert I ever crossed was one that I imagined. It's January 1991 in Wisconsin. I'm at the childhood party of a friend. I'm 11 and the radio is on. I'm drinking Coca-Cola and dancing in a partially renovated basement. All my friends are there. We're taking turns calling the station, requesting songs. At some point, I walk upstairs to use the bathroom and sit down in the living room where my friends' parents are watching sitcoms in recliners. News of Desert Storm disrupts the broadcast. In particular, I remember the green bright traces of artillery, the sky above the desert lit by distant blinks and glitterings. Though I have never seen a war, I'm old enough to understand that kids like me are dying while I'm singing with my friends. Uncertain what to think, I sit on the hard gray carpet, my language numb, the desert staring back at me across the screen. When I start to fall apart, weeping slowly and then, eventually, without control, my friend's mother calls my dad on the phone. Years later, the war still happening, my father gone, I can't remember the drive back home, what he said or didn't say, or even what I asked. Knowing my dad, we likely drove in silence, the air in his old Ford Econoline distilled by the kind of reverential quiet one reserves for moments that don't make sense. In the years since my father died, when his friends and family speak of him, they do so typically to celebrate his kindness, a disposition he possessed and cultivated, a kind of quiet creed. At his memorial, a group of friends and family stand solemnly around a small fire, burning the backyard grass of the house where I grew up. Looking old for the first time in her life, her eyes pulled low from lack of sleep, My mother asked that we each inscribe a message to my dad on a piece of paper. So we do. All of us together saying nothing, the small pages tucked like little poems into our hands. Intended to stand in for everything we wished we would have said to him, but didn't. The gesture feels genuine and love-filled, albeit late and grossly insufficient. One by one, the people who love my dad recite their messages and place their scraps of paper in the fire, their language turned to smoke and curling toward the sky. While the specifics of what I wrote that afternoon escapes me, I remember my intent. I wanted to thank my dad for his example, to honor him, to keep him near, made a silent pact as I stood there silently around the fire, a covenant conceived in grief through which I pledged to fledgling ethics. I would try to live as he did. Art had a code, my dad's friend Charlie says as he tosses his piece of paper into the flame. I didn't know it, and he never spoke of it, but I knew that it was there. For the philosopher John Rawls, our ethical framework emerges much like language from an inbuilt set of finite principles. In the theory of justice, Rawls claims to have modeled his developmental theory of justice after Chomsky's linguistic propositions. The acquisition of language is known to require theoretical constructions that far outrun the ad hoc precepts of a person's explicit grammatical knowledge, he suggests. And a similar situation holds in moral theory. For Rawls, our ethical foundations live within us as an innate defining aspect of our humanity, because everyone has in himself the whole form of a moral conception: to do good, to treat others fairly, to live ethically, then is to return to that which makes us human in the first place, a kind of coming home to a common moral center. I doubt my dad read either Chomsky or Rawls while he was living, and though he rarely spoke in ethics, he did live one. On December 1st, 1969, CBS postponed Mayberry RFD, a spin-off of the Andy Griffith Show, to broadcast the fates of young men into living rooms across America. Like most who were old enough to fight, my dad, 21 at the time, sat before the television watching the Selective Service Lottery, the first wartime military conscription since 1942. That night, the draft for Vietnam recruited an estimated 850,000 Americans into service. And over the course of the war's entirety, approximately 2.2 million civilians heard their numbers called, a math whose random violence turned them into soldiers. Earlier that morning, members of the House Armed Services Committee sealed 366 birth dates in small blue capsules and placed them in a large glass bowl atop a table. At 8 p.m., Alexander Perney, a congressman from New York, drew the first date, September 14th. To choose a number, a man in a dark suit simply reached into a jar and picked a capsule. My dad's birthday, August 24th, was capsule 36. I've watched the draft on YouTube. The film is grainy and off-colored. Roger Mudd, the CBS newscaster tasked with narrating the lottery, speaks in a low voice, coldly calm, professional. At about 8 minutes in, the camera pans the light blue board where the committee has placed the dates in ascending order. August 24th lives between May 7th and May 11th, a dark pronouncement. What I can't see, of course, is the room in which my father sits and watches. I have no sense of what my dad was thinking in that moment when they turned his name into a number, what he felt when he was asked to kill. What I do know is that when my grandfather was my dad's age, he joined the Army during World War II, and that my Uncle Rich later served in the U.S. Navy. We are, I suppose, to that degree a military family, which makes my dad's objection to his conscription an issue of which the family seldom speaks. Since the Elston Act of 1948, the Department of Defense has made provisions for conscientious objection in light of a person's religious training, which it defines as a deeply held moral or ethical belief to which all else is subordinate and upon which all else is ultimately dependent. I don't know when, but at some point, not long after they pulled his birthday from the deep blue sea of capsules, my dad decided he wouldn't go. He was not the only one. For men born between January 1st, 1944 and December 31st, 1950, the line between being brought into the world and leaving it is one the war obscured. Well, I suppose every birthday to some degree commemorates mortality, the draft directly tethered the specific moment of a beginning with the looming promise of an end. In the days following it, as the rest of the country decorated trees and strung up lights for Christmas, thousands of young men like my father, boys really, who heard their numbers broadcast on the nightly news, experienced their impermanence clearly and for the first real time. Over 57,000 Wisconsinites served in Southeast Asia. 1,239 of these men were killed. In truth, I have no idea if my dad feared dying that early winter evening in 1969. I imagine so, and yet everything I know of him suggests the prospect of harming others likely troubled him more than bleeding out himself in a distant field in Vietnam. My only recollection of asking my dad about his refusal to be a soldier was on a family road trip in the mid-90s, driving west across the country, camping along the way the night arrives before a campground does, the dark above us turning slowly to distant blues and ambient purples specked with early starlight. Perched on the passenger seat, I fiddle with the radio. At some point, I land on a song I like, a tune I've heard before in a movie about Vietnam. 20-some years later, I no longer recall the movie or the song, but I do remember asking my dad that night about the war. In my memory, he reaches over and stops talking. The desert of the darkness fills us. My father grabs my hand. The answer I had hoped to find that night about my dad's objection to Vietnam existed long before me. To petition for exemption, a dissenting citizen must write a letter and make clear the influence his beliefs have on how he lives his life. My father's youngest brother swears he watched him give a copy of this letter to my grandparents, though I haven't been able to track it down. Whatever words he found, I imagine they employed the rhetoric of the Catholic faith in which his parents raised him. Though the church's relationship to state violence is not a monolith, there does exist within the fabric of its teachings more than ample backing for my dad's decision. Speaking before the United Nations in 1965, Pope Paul VI outlined the Church's stance to Vietnam, suggesting that one must not forget that the blood of millions of men constitutes the sanction of the past, which unites us in the present and imbues upon us an oath to change the future history of the world. No more war, he argued, never again. In this way, the lived remembrance of atrocity maps a person's actions in the present. Set against the backdrop of a Christian framework that sees the past as prologue, the war my father wouldn't fight occurred primarily as a warning to be heeded, a pacifist ideal. In the letter he wrote to the Wisconsin Draft Board that winter in 1969 said anything, I trust it said something along those lines. The truth is that I'll never know. Since his sudden passing in the summer of 2015, I've started to imagine the letter differently. Decades later, his language lost, its author gone. Whatever my father wrote in the letter lives today as a kind of vanished talisman, a thing that I believe in but cannot see. A figment of my imagination, the words he used are born a second time, scattered fragments rising up like early grass through snow, emerging disconnected from the patchy earthwork of my memory. Poems too often live like this, as figments and as fragments. And so my father's letter objecting to the war in Vietnam is now a poem I've authored with him, a collaboration between the living and the dead. For better and for worse, I've imbued this vanished object with a meaning so significant the words have all but turned synonymous with the man himself, the person that he was, the father that I lost, as though his spirit lingers in the parlance that is missing, as if within the ethics of his refusal and the hidden syntax of his dissent, I might unveil his ghost. These days, when I think about the letter, I see my father as a young man, thin and handsome, his blonde hair falling long in curls across his thinly bearded face. It's December in Eau Claire, early morning, and he's sitting at the same desk at which I sit today, trying to bring him back. Though I won't be born until a decade later, I trace my being in the world to this imagined moment. He sits at his desk to write. I exist because his language did. My life is something written. The letter kept my father in the northwest central corner of Wisconsin. When a person objects to their conscription, they must make an equally meaningful contribution to the maintenance of national health. So once the local board accepted his petition, its members assigned my dad to an alternative form of service. Instead of killing communists in the jungles of Southeast Asia, they returned him to his alma mater. In the fall of 1970, my dad went to work for the theater department at the University in Eau Claire and never left. Ironically, it was there he met and fell in love with a woman from the very part of the world to which he had refused to go. Because of its proximity to Vietnam, the U.S. placed roughly 500,000 servicemen in Thailand's air and naval bases. My late grandmother remembers thinking of the daughter she sent to art school in America as she watched the U.S. Army planes coming and going over Bangkok. One she wouldn't see until a decade later when my mom finally returned to Thailand, crossing the ocean with a husband and a firstborn son. Unlike the woman and young girl standing at the edge of the Syrian desert on the television screen, my mother's second country was a life and land she chose. With the money from my dad's new job at the university, my parents put a small down payment on an unassuming house on Garfield Avenue. In the room I shared with my sister, my earliest memories involve my father reading poems to me at night instead of stories. His favorite poet was Edna St. Vincent Millay. He named our first dog Edna, and in particular, he loved the poem Lament. In it, the speaker, a widow, tries and fails to guide her children through the aftermath of her husband's passing. Listen, children, your father is dead. From his old coats, I'll make you little jackets. I'll make you little trousers from his old pants. There'll be in his pockets things he used to put there, keys and pennies covered with tobacco. Dan shall have the pennies to save in his bank. Anne shall have the keys to make a pretty noise with. Life must go on and the dead be forgotten. Life must go on though good men die. Anne, eat your breakfast. Dan, take your medicine. Life must go on. I forget just why. For reasons I'm assuming are obvious, I've read this poem upwards of 100 times in the years since my father passed away. The more I do, the closer I feel to him, as well as to the woman I imagine speaking, asking her children to listen. In Lament, this listening first takes the form of an acknowledgement. Your father is dead. But then, eventually, it occurs in the difficult acceptance of that fact, the world continuing despite a reason why. At the same time, however, I admire the honesty of the widow's failure to navigate this uncertainty. The making of the little jacket from the larger seems to me a moment of refusal, of keeping the invisible alive in things, as does the passing forward into the future, the keys of the door between the living and the dead, the pennies I imagine one might use to pay for passage back and forth. Lament also feels like a refusal insofar as the poem then ends paradoxically by not ending. The failure of memory to preserve the past becomes the why that haunts the poem's conclusion, an overwhelming absence that leaves me hanging in the aftermath, a kind of ghost there and not there, hesitant and only partially healed. If there exists a language capable of naming this experience, I imagine it happens in Lament and in many of the other poems my dad would read to me when I was young, an activity I've come to see as preparation for the days ahead in which he knew his son would have to navigate the world himself. Now that I am a father, I think often about my dad reading poems to me as a child, of the still real music of his voice and of the language that wasn't his but that he gave me nonetheless. I think as well about that night in January at the cold beginning of a war that marks my generation in the same way that Vietnam marked his. How he must have wanted more than anything to make the world make sense for me but couldn't. What could he have said? What reason why could have proved sufficient? The easy, ready-made explanations for the persistent violence of our country's history with the desert nations of the Middle East taste like sand and metal, like oil and like salt. According to the Watson Institute at Brown University, roughly 800,000 people have died directly as a result of war violence in the region. Most of these, of course, are civilian casualties, and the number indirectly killed as a result of disease and the destruction of infrastructure remains unknowable. Millions have been displaced. There isn't a way for a man who was born and raised and lived and died in the American Midwest, or for anyone really, to translate the reality of a far-off war to his young son. And so as we sat there in the van together all those years ago, a desert growing in the space between us and our inability to speak, I like to think there might have been a moment when the silence that engulfed us felt sufficient. Maybe my father's reticence that night is what George Oppen means a bit later of being numerous, by clarity in the sense of transparence. I don't mean that much can be explained, clarity in the sense of silence. For Oppen, a poet torn between his civic and creative callings, one of a writer's many jobs is to translate our ineffable contingency, making clear a line between the known and unknown, the self and other, a scrawl in the sand that forms a letter and then another. In this light, maybe when I say poetry, what I really mean is something closer to empathy or sympathy, a language that attempts to navigate the desert of our difference, our dark cartography. And yet, so long as we feel sympathy, we also feel we are not accomplices, writes Susan Sontag. Our sympathy proclaims our innocence. To the degree that this is true, it appears that maybe our compassion, the human compass that connects us, risks participating in the very violence it detests. This predicament feels especially true when making art as an American Midwesterner whose experience of war is almost always secondhand. From the safety of my distant vantage in Wisconsin, I can't imagine how dreadful, how terrifying war is. So whatever images I might make of it within a poem cannot be more than an invitation to pay attention. If this sounds voyeuristic, I suspect it does because it is. Thus, at the heart of the book I wrote lives the persistent fear that in writing it, I have participated in and contributed to the atrocities I wrote the book against. Although invisible and mostly silent, our connection to other people conditions the context of our complicity, as much a promise of redemption as it is the premise of our guilt. Still, thinking of my dad, his letter hidden, his objection irretrievable, I have to also wonder if there isn't someone, somewhere, still alive, because he sat down at a wooden desk and wrote it, a man or woman who didn't die, who lived as he did to hold their children. Many months ago, on the morning of the 5th of May, as I sat in the window light of a hospital in Fort Atkinson, holding my newborn daughter for the first time, I thought again about my father, how much I wished him there to meet her. His absence filled the room, and I thought too again of the mother and young girl I watched on television all those years ago in Syria. Though I had hoped my book might somehow serve as a kind of home for them, an oasis framed by talk, I have to wonder if the attention paid there to the suffering of others was more for my sake and for my daughter's. Books, of course, aren't homes, and they most certainly aren't people. In a real world where even empathy falls short, the mother and daughter to whom the poems in Orient are dedicated may or may not be living. I will never know. What I do know is that here in America, in the southeast corner of Wisconsin, both my daughters will come of age and learn to speak connected to a violence of a world they cannot understand. They will have to learn to pay attention, to translate, to imagine, to reach for language in a time and place beset upon by ghosts remains the fate of all of us who live and breathe in a world we can only ever partially know, to shape an ethics out of sand. My daughters, too, will have to cross the desert. Like me, they'll need their father. Thank you. So those are my kids. If you haven't figured out, those are my kids. That's my dad, much younger, thinner version of my dad. I think, is there time for questions? I have no idea.
Yeah, definitely.
So, one of the things I'm hoping is at least recognizable is that the poem or the essay comes out of the poem, right? Or that the poet in me and the prose writer in me are not that far apart, I don't think. I think of both activities, writing an essay or writing a poem, as attempts to make sense of something that probably necessarily isn't, that you can't make sense of. One of the things I tell my students, or one of the places I'm quick to draw attention to when I'm reading drafts of students' works, and it's true of my own drafts also, or of my friends' drafts when they send their drafts to me, is that usually the moments in a poem that are weakest, or the moments in an essay even which are weakest, are the moments which feel most certain. And certainty isn't the same as clarity. I think what I love about poems or essays or just language, or especially creative language, which is different than colloquial language, is that language can be uncertain and clear at the same time. And I think that's what I'm hoping, that's what I was trying to do with that poem. That's what I'm trying to do with that essay. It's what I'm trying to encourage my students to do, and it's what I'm trying to do, and it's what all the writers who I am moved by the most are trying to do.
Thank you all for coming.